Thank you for joining us today. My name is Yasmina Greco. I'm with O'Reilly Media, and I will be your host for today's webcast. Today, folks, we have Jennifer Murphy presenting the Google Plus History API. Jennifer is the author of the brand new O'Reilly book, Developing with Google Plus, Practical Guide to the Google Plus Platform. We're so excited to have Jenny with us today to present this webcast for you all. I will turn the program over to Jenny in just a moment, but first I'd like to go over some housekeeping things to help you get the most out of today's webcast. Where we can interact with each other during the event and where you can submit your questions for Jenny. We find that our audience usually has a lot of good knowledge to share, so we encourage you all to chat freely during the event. However, if you have questions for Jenny, please preface them with a capital letter Q so we know that they're for her and we can make sure she sees them for Q&A. You can also open, move, and resize any of the other widgets. If you'd like to tweet from the Twitter widget today, you may need to give it permission to access your account. It will automatically append the event's hashtag to your tweet so you don't have to. And folks, today our hashtag is Google+, all one word. If you should have any problems during the event, please take a look at the Help widget. If you continue to have problems, please post it in the group chat and one of our staff will help you right away. For choppy audio or stalled visuals, please try refreshing your window. And remember, the best thing you can do for a good audio stream is to close any apps that could interfere. People always ask, so we'd like you to know we are recording today's webcast, and we'll have an archive ready usually within 48 hours. And folks, at this time, it is my pleasure to turn the program over to Jenny for her presentation. Hello, Jenny.
Hi, everybody. So I guess I'll dig right into stuff. So I'm going to be talking to you about what's new on the Google Plus platform, which is mostly the Google Plus History API. But I have a little bit of bonus material, specifically mobile deep linking, which is something we released only a couple weeks ago. Before I get into that, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I am a developer programs engineer at Google, which means I help you, all of you developers out there, build cool stuff with our APIs and technologies. Specifically, I spent a lot of time with the Google Plus APIs. So, what are we going to be talking about today? Here's our agenda. First, I'm going to give you a little bit of that bonus content, mobile deep linking. This is something we released really recently. It's really exciting, and it allows you to deep link to share links on Google Plus that link deeply into your mobile applications for iOS and Android. So I'll be telling you a little bit about what they are and how you use them. And then I'll get to the core of the presentation, the History API. I'll tell you what the Google Plus History API is. I'll show it to you in action. And then I'll show you how to set up a starter project so that you can have code, working code with the Google Plus History API that you can build your applications from. That example project will be showing you how to authorize the user and how to write moments. So first, let's talk a little bit about mobile deep links. What is a mobile deep link? A mobile deep link is a shared link on Google Plus that links deeply into your mobile application. A mobile application that you're writing might have multiple screens. For example, if you're writing a newsreader, you might display a whole bunch of different stories in your Chrome format. If you have a game, you might have multiple levels or racetracks for a car racing game. And wouldn't it be cool if you could share links to those specific pieces of content within your mobile application? And this is exactly what mobile deep linking allows you to do. So how does it end up working in detail? So you have a share control in your mobile application. The share control allows the user to share content from your app. They share it to Google+. You get a cool-looking mobile deep link with details about your application and about the specific deep content. The deep link appears on Google+, and then the post if another user comes, the user's friends, and clicks on that link, it takes them directly to the deep content within your mobile application. But what if they don't have the mobile application installed? What it does is it takes those users to the appropriate page on the appropriate application store, the Google Play Store, for example, for Android, and allows them to download the application. So that if they return and click on the link, they'll be able to go to that deep content. So how do you add mobile deep links to your application? So the first thing you have to do is go and create an API console project or take an existing project that you may be using for mobile widgets and enable deep linking. And I'll show you how to do that in a moment. And then you just have to add a little bit of code that allows you to create the deep links for the share widget, and then allows you to process handle those incoming links and direct the users to the correct part of your application. So let's take a look at these steps. And turn on screen sharing. The first step I mentioned is on the Google API console. You can find the Google API console for your existing use of your mobile applications, any other Google API use you have, by going to code.google.com/apis/console. So I went here and it redirected me to an existing project I have, which is fine. But you can also create new projects here if you don't have one already. We'll create one. We'll create an awesome project. So we created our new project, and I can show you the mobile deep linking controls under the API Access panel. So we come over to the left menu and click on API Access. Since this is a new project, we don't have an OAuth 2 client ID. So we'll create one. If you have an existing project, this will already be done. So we'll create one for our awesome product. And since we're dealing with mobile applications, we're going to select Installed Application here. Next, we tell it where we're going to be installing this mobile application. The control for deep linking is the same on Android and iOS. It's this deep linking link down below. You just need to enable it. If you have an existing client ID for your existing widgets, you just need to come in and use the edit control to come to the same panel. So we'll create one with a fake bundle ID and store ID. And you can see now, on the API console, deep linking is enabled. That's all you have to do. So now that we have it enabled, we need our application to be able to create these deep links to tell Google+ where we want users to go on our mobile application. And we also need to be able to handle the incoming links. So to find out how to do that, we're going to go to developers.google.com/plus/mobile. Within the page about sharing on Google+ for Android and iOS, there is a new section on sharing with deep links to your application. So clicking on that brings us down a little bit, about halfway down the page. The page structure is the same for Android and iOS. And the flow is pretty similar too. The first step is to create a client for each supported platform. We've already done this. That was the stuff we just did in the API console. We're more interested in writing posts with these deep links. There are two different ways to write deep links to, in your application. You're going to be using the existing share control code. You're just going to be adding a little bit of stuff for either of these cases. The first case is using a full URL identifier. So if the content on your application has a web page representation, all those deep link targets, all those levels on your game, for example, have their own web page with structured markup on them, this is going to be the step, this is going to be the process that has the least code added to your mobile application. So how you do that is, when you're creating your share intent, the same way you create it for existing share controls on your mobile applications, we're just going to put a couple extras in. We're going to put our deep link ID in. This will be the URL to the page that represents that data in our application. And then we're also going to put a little bit of text to tell users who are seeing the deep link share what's available to them there. There's going to be a whole bunch of other metadata that we want to show. A description, a thumbnail, a title. In this case, because we already have a web page with that content that already has structured markup on it, whether you added that structured markup for the history API or for improved search results, same structured markup. The share link, the deep link share control is going to extract that content from that page, so you don't have to put it into your mobile application. Alternatively, if you'd like programmatic control from your application, or you just don't have a page for all of the content that you want to deep link, you can use a URL path identifier. This, instead of having a full URL, you just have a path that identifies the content that you're deep linking. And then, rather than us going to that page and fetching it for you, you just specify it directly in your code. You create a bundle that you then attach as another extra on your deep link. And here you'll specify the title, description, and thumbnail URL. This is the process for Android. It's very, very similar for iOS. Instead of a URI path identifier, it's a unique identifier. But in terms of other than that kind of syntax, the flow is very, very similar. So now that you have that code in your application, the share control now can deep link the content in your application. But that's only half the story. We have posts on Google+ that link to our content, but we need our application to be able to handle them, so that when another user comes and clicks on that link, we take them to the right place in the mobile application. This is pretty easy. There are a couple steps we have to do. We have to create an activity in Android, for example. So we're going to have to add it to our manifest to specify that it exists and tell our application where to find it. In this case, we called it parse deep link activity. Then we're going to have to implement the code to handle it. So when a deep link comes in, it's going to trigger this. This code will go in and extract the deep link information into a local variable. And then it's going to do stuff that our application does. One easy way to do it is just to fire off the local intent. We're going to take that ID and pass it to our own implementation of the intent. And then our application will do whatever it does. It'll navigate to the right screen. It'll set up any state. And then the deep link has been processed. And that's really it. All the other handling, for example, taking the user to the App Store, if the app isn't installed, is handled by the code that's already there. That is mobile deep linking. You can learn more about it by going to developers.google.com/plus/mobile. You'll find information there about the Android flow that I talked about, as well as the iOS flow, which is over here in the left side menu. So, stopping screen sharing, and we're going to switch back to the slides. You should all see the slides now. So now we're shifting from that mobile deep link, that bonus content, over to the stuff you probably came for. What is the Google+ History API? So what is the Google+ History API? The Google+ History API is an API that's in developer preview, which means it's an experimental API that allows you to write moments about what your users do to Google+. Moments are representations of all the stuff that people do while they're using your application. So for example, in the previous application we just described, the mobile application, we have like a game. When people say a game, they may complete levels, they may unlock new content. People are reading a news app, they may read news, they may watch videos, they may comment on the content. All these things that people do are the moments that you can write to the Google+ History API that then allows Google+ to take that rich content and do interesting things with. So how does it work from your application? So the first step is the user signs in with Google+. I'm going to be showing you this today with the sign-in button, which is another feature of the same developer preview. But you can sign the user in using regular OAuth also. For example, if you already have that implemented. As a user uses your application, they watch videos, they comment on entries, stuff like that. Those actions are saved by your application to the user's history. Now the user can go and find those moments in their Google+ history and share them on Google+. Those show up in their stream like any other post, and then their friends can engage on that activity, and most importantly, there's attribution back to you, back to your domain, the creator of that moment. They know where that moment came from. They know where that user was doing stuff to create those moments. So let's take a look at it in action. And I'm going to show you an example implementation of the Google+ History API, the client-side starter, which is the same code that I will be showing you how to set up in just a few minutes. So you come here, and we follow the same steps that I just mentioned on that slide. We sign in. We get an OAuth dialog. It tells me as the user what I'm signing in for, what I'm granting to this application. I am letting the Google+ documentation code sample know that I'm Jenny Murphy on Google. So by signing in, they'll know who I am, which is kind of an important step of being able to sign in. The application needs to identify me. And the interesting part, I am authorizing it to send activity to my private Google+ history, that private bucket of stuff that kind of represents all the stuff I've been doing, my history. So we'll click on Connect to grant the starter project that access. And we see that some stuff has been revealed. There's some buttons down here that represent examples of those kinds of activities I mentioned. Like maybe I create a blog post. Maybe I comment on another blog post. Maybe I'm in a music application and I'm listening to some music. And as that's going on, we can see a bunch of activity down here in the pane below. These are the REST requests that are going on behind the scenes in the application, which would normally not be shown to the user, that shows those moments being inserted into Google+ as I click on those buttons to simulate the stuff I'm doing. So now, it's a little bit later. As a user, I finished doing all the stuff I was doing, and I want to go take a look at it in Google+ history. So I was like, what have I been up to today? So I come over to the Google+ history, and I see a lot of stuff. Some of the buttons I just clicked are here right now. I can see that I was just listening to When Johnny Comes Marching Home on the starter application. I also created a picture of G-Bikes. So these are some things that I just came from the buttons I was pressing just a moment ago. But there's other history here too. History from other Google sources and other implementations of the History API. I can see, for example, that I +1 an entry about macaroon. Also made a reservation at Charlie's Cafe. So this is my private space where I can see all those moments that make up my activity during the day, including the ones I just created. Let's take a look at what it looks like when I share one of those. If I share, I can see that this was created on developers.google.com. This would link back to your domain. Neat. And I can share that to, I was going to share it to an empty circle. I can share it to Google+, my friends and my family. So now I can go back to my profile, and I can see that I've shared that moment with the audiences that I think will care the most about it. In this case, my friends and family. Those G-Bikes are rad. Later, as they see it, they can see the content as well as that link back to developers.google.com. And that is the History API from end to end. Turning to the slides. Now I'm going to show you how you can get the same code working now and use that as a starting point for integrating it into your application. There are 3 steps to this. First, we're going to set up the starter application. Just get it downloaded and installed and go through all the steps to set up your API client so that Google knows who you are. Next, I'm going to show you how to authorize the user using the sign-in button. And finally, we're going to write moments with the REST API. So let's set up your application. You can see steps, you can see instructions on how to do this on developers.google.com/plus/history #getting There, you'll see that there's a few different sub-steps in here that we have to take care of. As I mentioned, this is an experimental developer preview API, so we're going to have to sign up for the developer preview. Once we're signed up, we're going to go enable the Google Plus History API and create an OAuth2 client ID. This allows Google to know what APIs we want to access and allows Google to know who we are when we make API calls. Then finally, we're going to grab a copy of the starter project and download it to a local web server that we can use. Switching back over to screen sharing. Take a look at this. We're going to start off in the API console. And we can actually go back to the API project we just created. Or actually first, before we do that, we need to sign up for the preview, of course. So to sign up for the preview, you go to developers.google.com/plus/history/preview. Or you can find it in the left side navigation under History API, Preview Sign Up. It's pretty easy to find. Once we go there, we see a page that tells us a little bit about the history. Most importantly, expect the preview to be bumpy. We're releasing it early to you developers so that you can give us feedback about how you want to use it and how we can make it better. This is an important part of kind of the life cycle of our APIs, especially newer experimental ones like this. We really want feedback from you. You can report issues on the developer forum or in our issue tracker. So anyway, having read all this content, we want to sign up. You go down here, there's a little email form. You put in your email address, and you sign up. You'll be taken to a page that says you've joined the Google Moments preview. You might receive an email that you have to click to confirm your email address. But I didn't have to. I went straight into the preview. So if you see something about having to confirm your email, check your email and make sure you confirm that you're joining this group. This is because we're using a Google group to authorize you to access the API. Everyone who's in this group can access the API and see the sign-in button. This also means that if you want to leave the preview at any time, you can leave it just like any other Google group. So now that we're in the preview, reload the API console. We're back on Awesome Project, which we created during the mobile deep link section. And we're going to reuse the same project. So the first thing we need to do is we need to enable the APIs that we're going to use. So we're going to scroll down, and we're going to enable the Google Plus API and the Google Plus History API. The Google Plus History API listing right here will only appear if you're in the preview. So if you come to the screen and you don't see it, check your email and make sure that you've confirmed your admittance into the group. So both of these switched. We're all set up. That step is complete. Now we want to go create a client ID. So we're going to scroll back up, and we're going to go back to the API Access panel, the same one we were at earlier when we were setting up our mobile deep links. And we're going to create a client ID. If you haven't created one before, you'll see that big blue button we saw earlier. but we already have one. So we're going to click the little gray button just below our other client IDs. This time we're building a web application. We're using the starter project, which is a JavaScript web application. Since we're developing with it, we're just playing around. We're going to run it on localhost. So we're going to tell that. So now we've created a web application client ID for development on localhost. We have a client ID up here, which is how Google knows who we are. We'll be supplying that whenever we make API requests or whenever we render a sign-in button. Next, we have one other step during the preview. We have to add a JavaScript origin. Since we're writing this application all in JavaScript, we need to authorize our client to be able to accept JavaScript requests from the place the sign-in button is sourced. +1.google.com, https://+1.google.com. This is noted on the documentation, so you don't need to remember it. Great. We have a client ID. We're going to copy that for later. And we're all set up with the setup phase. We have everything we need to start. Oh, wait, we have to download it. Almost forgot. An important step. We need code to actually use. So returning to the documentation for the history API, we're going to go download the files for the client-side starter. And you can find this on developers.google.com/plus/history/client-side flow. Or you can navigate to it the same way I just did in the left side menu. Client-side flow example under History API. We're going to want to download it. We click on that link in the menu and we click on a download link. This is going to give us a zip file. Decompressing the zip file, it will find our starter project files in there. And those are all the steps we need to do before we dive into the code. So switching back to the slides, these are the steps we just completed. We have all the stuff we need to set up our application. The next step is to authorize the user. Within this one, we have a few little substeps. We're going to be using the sign-in button to do this, which takes care of a lot of the heavy lifting of OAuth 2. If you've done OAuth 2 implementations before, you know they can be a little bit hairy, a little bit complicated. But we're going to use the sign-in button, which is part of the same developer preview, to try and take care of some of this heavy lifting for us. It behaves just like any other OAuth flow, though. So the first thing is to initiate the OAuth flow. This is where the sign-in button helps a lot. It takes care of all of this. We drop the sign-in button in, and it will initiate the OAuth flow for us. It's going to render that permission dialog. This part is handled by Google. This is when the user will authorize us to use the application, or to use our application, authorize Google to give their data to us. Next, we're going to complete the flow. This is where it forks a little bit depending on the implementation of your application. We're going to be using the client-side flow today, all in JavaScript, because it's a little bit simpler and it's a great place to start. There's an alternative server-side flow, which has an extra step. The server has to verify its identity by making another background post to Google. This allows you to make requests to Google APIs while the user is offline. In the client-side flow, they can only make requests, or you can only make requests while they're viewing the web page. But we'll be sticking with the client-side flow today. And we'll be done. Well, let's take a look at that in code. So going back to screen share. So let's see where we are. We've unzipped that zip file we downloaded. And we can see there are a few files in there. There's a static directory that contains a bunch of stuff we don't really need to touch. There's some CSS there. There's some sample data and a JSON file. and some JavaScript that's just there to take care of some of the application stuff for us. And a jQuery plugin, you don't need to worry about this stuff. The interesting part is this index.html file. So let's take a look at it in action. It's always cool to see stuff working before we try and modify it, just to see where our starting point is. So here we go. I'm running on my local web server, and here's the decompressed client-side example with no changes to the code we download. The page loads. We see a sign-in area, but no button below it. We see write to moments, and nothing below that either. And then we see a link that goes back to our Google Plus history. We also see a debug panel below that indicates there's a problem. Client ID is malformed. It's your client ID right now. This will be a hint into our next step. So now that we've seen our starting point, let's hit the code and start making it work. So here's the code. I've opened up index.html. This is where we'll be making all of our modifications. Up at the top, you can see a bunch of that JavaScript, some of it loaded from a CDN, some of it loaded from that static directory. This is just stuff to help with the look and feel of the application and stuff that's not really relevant to the history API or the sign-in button. But there are two files that do matter. Plus1.js. This is used to render Google Plus web plugins, including the sign-in button. If you already have the +1 button, this may already be in your pages. If not, you're going to need to add this to use the sign-in button. And client.js. This is the Google JavaScript API client library. This is the code that allows us to make API requests to Google so that we can write moments or identify the user that just logged in. So scrolling on down, we can find the code that powers the sign-in button. It's already here. There's a few attributes that I'll tell you a little bit about. It starts with the element itself, G:+. This just tells the JavaScript that loads the Google Plus plugins that there's supposed to be a plugin here. There's an action attribute. The action attribute has a value connect, and this tells the JavaScript code that we want a sign-in button here. Below that is the client ID. This is the client ID from the API console. Right now it's set to your client ID, which is pretty clearly a placeholder. So we'll just replace that while we're in here. So let's go back to the API console and the right API console and grab our client ID. This is the one we just created. We'll copy that and we'll paste it in there. Save the file. This is how the Google API servers know who we are. Same with the plugin servers. Well, this is scope. Scope is telling Google and the user what kind of information we want access to. If you remember that OAuth brand page, that little pop-up that appeared, this is how the whole system determines what stuff to list there. It also determines what data we get access to via APIs. There's one implicit scope whenever you use the sign-in button. That is the plus.me scope. This is implicit because for sign-in to actually work, you need to know who signed in. Otherwise, it doesn't really do anything useful. So it's implicitly handled by the sign-in button. We have one other scope that we'll need for the history API, plus.moments.write. This tells Google and our user that we want to be able to write moments of their private Google Plus history. And finally, there's a callback. This is where our code starts to come alive. The onSign-in callback, which can actually be any function name you want, is a JavaScript function in the public namespace that is executed whenever there's an event on the sign-in button. Let's go take a look at that code. So we scroll on down to a section of our code labeled a JavaScript for the sign-in button, aptly named. So this is the callback that is called whenever an event happens on the sign-in button. And we can see that it was actually already called. That there was a problem section of our debug panel was called when there was a problem with the sign-in process. In that case, it was that our client ID was malformed. But it's also called when there's a success. And you know it's a success because the error is not populated. There's no error, you can assume success. A couple of things happen, or there's a couple of things we need to do when there's a successful login. The first one is toggle the interface. So if there's content that we only want to display to signed-in users, we're going to toggle the interface so that they can see that content that's only available to them. You can also make AJAX calls here to get content to display on the page. But in this simple example, we're just revealing some divs. And then you also need to store the authentication result for later use. That's because this is an all JavaScript application, and as we move around from one page to the other, we're going to need to pull that stored authentication information. Otherwise, the user would have to log in every time they refresh, which isn't what we want. So let's take a look at the implementation of these methods. Toggle interface is pretty straightforward. It's going to hide the sign-in panel, which is the most important part. Once the user signed in, you want to hide the sign-in button. Otherwise, they'll be really confused. And then we're going to reveal a couple other panels. We're going to reveal a panel that allows them to communicate moments. They can only communicate moments when they're signed in. And we're going to provide a sign out panel for them so that they can sign out. Another good idea. We also store the auth result. How you store the auth result will depend a lot on your implementation. In this trivial case, we're just sticking it in a cookie. Cookies are simple. They work well. So we'll stash it in a cookie for 7 days. And below that are some other kind of boilerplate functions that take care of other corner cases of the application. We have a helper method to get the stored authentication information from the cookie, and some code that runs when the web page loads. We have something that gets the authentication result and tells the debug panel that we're already signed in. It also toggles the interface so that we can see the sign out link and the right moments buttons if we're already logged in. We have the functionality that provides sign out. And finally, one call that allows us to view our profile. This is a great example of the JavaScript API client library. So what we've done is we've found a function to the Get Me button, Get My Profile. We fetch the authentication information if we need to, and we prime the Google Plus API client, or the Google API client. It happens to be using the Google Plus API. Next, we create a request. We're going to be getting our own profile. So getting people, me, from the Google Plus API. And we're only interested in a few fields here. So we just want to get our display name, ID, image, and URL. And you can see the details of how this URL was constructed on the Google Plus API reference doc. Once the API request is successful, we're going to log that response to our debug panel. So let's see this stuff in action. Going back to our local copy of the JavaScript starter, we reload the page, and we find that the sign-in button appears now. Replacing that placeholder with our client ID appears to have worked. We click on the sign-in link, and we're presented with the Connect Awesome product in Google+. It has the same two things that we mentioned before, access to our Google Plus profile, and the ability to write moments to our history. We connect, and then we see all that animation. The sign-in button is gone, the sign-out panel has appeared, and we can make API calls. Let's do the Get Me one that I just showed you the code for. We click on it, and attempting to get my profile, and it was successful. It made an API call, and this is how your application would identify who is just logged in. You can see that I'm Jenny Murphy. You can see a link to my Google Plus profile, and you can see a URL for my image, for my profile image. This might be great to make the sign-in button a little prettier. You know, you're currently signed in as this user, all that kind of stuff. And also just to identify the user, correlated to any internal user ID you have. That's the sign-in flow. Now that the user signed in, we can start looking at the history API itself. So switching back over to slides. Next step is probably the moment you've been waiting for, writing those moments to the user's Google Plus history. Because now that we're signed in, there's nothing stopping us now. So how does writing moments work? You have your website, your web application, your mobile application, whatever application your application ends up looking like, and you write moments whenever a user takes an action. Each one of those moments has a target. For example, if I'm watching a video, the video is the target. If I just completed a level in a game, a web page representing that level represents the target. When you post that moment to Google, we will go and we will fetch that target page. And we will look for schema.org markup to capture all that rich content. So first, let's talk about that write step. What does that look like? So you send us a JSON request body. It specifies a few different things. It specifies a type, which is one of a taxonomy of types that we provide you. Everything from creating content to listening. They mirror very closely those buttons on that starter project. And there's also an add type that's used for kind of a general case. You send us the URL for the target, which is, as I mentioned, like the page fit video or whatever content was being acted upon. And some moments also have resulted data. You would send that along too. For example, when I comment on something, I'm commenting on the target blog entry, and I'm also creating a comment object in the result. And you'd send us the details about that comment there. So let's take a look. This is a very simple one, a view activity. I viewed a video. You can see it looks pretty simple. You're specifying the type, and you're specifying the target URL. And a little bit more sophisticated, like writing a comment, you can see a very similar structure, except there's a result that specifies some details about the comment that was created. So let's talk about that next step, that fetch step. This is where it gets really interesting. Here, you use schema.org markup. You may already be familiar with schema.org because it is a way to add structured markup to your pages to make them render well in search engine results, supported by all major search engines right now. And it's used by a whole bunch of different APIs at Google, including the History API and the mobile link API I just mentioned before. Oh, and also the +1 button, of course. Can't forget that. So what you do is you will mark up your page, and you will tell us the elements that are already on your page that define the structure of that page. So you'll specify what element of your page describes it, what element of your page names it, and also what kind of content is on that page. So here we have a blog entry. We're specifying a name, which is the title, a description, and an image. And one of the cool parts about schema.org markup, unlike some other ways of adding structured markup, is you don't have to add any new elements to your page. You're just adding attributes which tell us what content is important. And it's the content that's already there. So let's take a look at this part in code. Switching back to screen share again. And picking off right where we left off in the code, JavaScript for writing moments. Here we can see that we've added some click handlers to write sample. Let's go back up and look at that. This is some HTML above. So scrolling on up, we can see our HTML elements for writing those samples. Here's one right here. It is a button that simulates one of those activities. In this case, it's an add activity. And what we've done is we've taken that JSON payload that you send to the REST API, and we've just stuffed it into a data-moment attribute on the button, which is kind of taking advantage of an interesting case of HTML5. You can put pretty much anything you want in data elements or data attributes. We've created a data moment attribute where we're storing that moment description. We specify a target URL, which is an example page that has schema.org markup, which I'll show you really quickly. And we have a whole bunch of different sample pages here that you can see the source code for, and you can see examples of that schema.org markup. Okay, going back to the code. So we have a target, and we have the rest of the payload. In this case, we're doing a simple, more generic add activity. Let's go back to the JavaScript down below and see what we actually do with it. So when the user clicks that button, we call the write moment function, and we pass the payload in. The payload comes from the contents of that attribute. Here we're going to see code that is strikingly similar to the code we use to fetch the user's profile. We're going to set the authentication information from the cookie if it's available, and then we're going to make a request using the JavaScript API client library. Since we're writing instead of reading, we're going to do post. Since we're using the history API, we're going to hit a different path. We're going to write moments to the user's vault or history, and we set a debug flag to true, which fetches the page synchronously and gives us a lot more details on it. If you're in production, you probably want to turn this off, but it's great for debugging and development. And we have a callback. Just like the other callback, we write the moment response back to the debug panel. So seeing that in action, clear a debug panel, and we write that create activity. We can see that we sent that moment over. There's our payload, our target page. Google went, fetched structured markup from that, and sent it back to us what it was able to capture from that page and what it stored in the user's Google Plus history. We have a whole bunch of details here. We have image, we have description of the content up there, all that stuff that was extracted from that web page. And this is the moment that was written to the user's Google Plus history. We can see it here in my history right now if we want to. So we go, oh shoot, we can click on this link right here. See them on my Google Plus history. And we can see that G-Bike moment right here. That's how it's implemented. We're going back to the slides for a quick recap. So what did we just do with the History API? We set up our application. So we did all those pre-steps to set the groundwork for us to start coding. Once we had the code in place running on our local web server, we used the sign-in button to authorize the user. And then finally, we wrote moments using our REST API and schema.org structured markup on our pages, on our target pages. That's it. That's the Google Plus History API. As I mentioned, it's an experimental API. It's really early. It has some rough corners, and we really want to hear your feedback. We want to hear what you want to use this for. We want to hear different kinds of content that you may want to be able to share as moments, different kinds of activities that you may want to capture. So give it a try, play with it in your web application, and let us know what you think. Bye, everyone.